You've briefly seen me use named ranges through selection and the automatic updating of the range reference when the selection encompasses a name. In this lesson, we'll start with the different ways of accessing named ranges by formula, and then I'll cover some other ways to name your ranges to organize them and make them a bit easier to use. Additionally, I'll provide an example of the different uses of workbook scoped names versus worksheet scoped names. Finally, I'll introduce you to exercise 3 to complete the chapter. As you should recognize, this is the exercise 2 solution. For exercise 3, you'll be adding names and updating the formulas to use named ranges to make the formulas more readable. Furthermore, you'll be using differently scoped names so that you can create a copy of the worksheet and maintain internal formula consistency. Before you do that, we'll create a few names as part of this lesson and create an approach for you to follow when creating yours. Having an approach to defining your names is as important, if not more so, than the names themselves. You could have 150 useful and meaningful names in a workbook, but if they are difficult to find and remember, then you'll have to find and select the range manually anyways. This keeps the formulas readable, but you do lose some of the power of the named ranges this way. I like my named ranges to give me an idea as to their location and their meaning, so let's start on our Client List tab. For any names that I create on this tab, I'm going to want to make them as workbook-wide scopes, since this is a worksheet that I will access frequently from elsewhere and less frequently internally. This is a good rule of thumb to help you determine the appropriate scope. Ask yourself if the range in question will be used from other worksheets or only within the current worksheet. If the answer is only within the current worksheet or within a specific other worksheet, then you can use the worksheet scope. Otherwise, you'll want to use the workbook scope. If that is the case, I can use a simple creation method using my named range box. I'm going to give names to two of the address components, the street and the city. I could simply select range C2 through C77 and call it street, but that only contains partial information. Rather than street, I'm going to call the range J Street. Why lowercase j? Well, Excel has a ton of functions, but there are relatively few functions that begin with the letters Q, X, Y, J, K, U, and Z. If I were to fully work out this workbook, I'd create a tab specifically listing each tab name and the lowercase letter that I've assigned to it. In this case, I'll use J for client list, and I'll use X for line item. I'm going to do the same for the city data and call it J City. I'll let you name the rest of this tab, and we'll continue on to the line item tab. I'm going to create one name here and call it X Client Code, and I'm going to point it at A2 to A177. I'm creating this name just to demonstrate the value of the initial letter in the name. So now let's jump over to our Sales Report tab. As you filled these formulas out, you have a good idea as to all the pieces at play. The client code drives all of the lookups, with some of the lookups requiring additional other lookups, such as the referral information and the product description and cost of goods. We've added 3 workbook level named ranges to incorporate into this worksheet, and the 2 of use are the J Street and J City names. So let's start by modifying each of those formulas. Starting on the street cell, if I edit the cell, which you can do easily by either clicking in the formula bar or pressing F2 on your keyboard. Beware the F2 key, as pressing F1 will open the Excel help, and that can take a while to load. But anyhow, I'm going to start by deleting my client list portion and replacing it with the named range. I could just navigate to the Client List tab and select the range, but I know that I have a named range there and I want to use it. One approach could be to go to the Formula tab, click the Use in Formula command, and select J Street from the list. With just a handful of names in a workbook, this can be really quick and easy. I can now press Enter, and my formula has been updated. But what about when you have dozens or hundreds of names? That list could be really long. So let's go to this city cell and make our change here. Again, I'll delete the prior reference in my formula bar and assume that the only thing I know is that my named ranges on the client list start with J. If I type J, since there are no other functions associated with the letter J, an important key to this being useful, I get a list of my named ranges that start with that letter. I can now use my arrow keys to select the one I want by pressing up or down, and then simply pressing Tab completes my name. Let's delete the J City so now I can show you what happens if I put X in. Typing X gives me a list of the names that begin with X and a few functions. Now if I replace X with A, I get a list that's so long full of functions that there's a scroll bar. These are functions, so we can't hide them. I've listed the letters on your screen that I use as leading characters, as those letters have few enough functions to make them useful for beginning named ranges and getting this list. Anyhow, we want to look through the J city name, so I'll go ahead and re-enter that. Can you imagine how much faster you might have completed the exercise by spending 5 minutes up front pre-naming your ranges and then just typing them into the index and match functions? All of that sheet and range selection replaced by quick name entries. But now, let's look at the worksheet-specific level names. Each of the first 4 tabs are going to have names that you'll want to access from this tab or from other tabs, so they'll all want to be workbook scope names. This tab, on the other hand, will have some names that we'll only want to refer to locally, for example, our local client match calculation. To make the client match a worksheet name, we must use the Define Name button. Having selected the cell, pressing Define Name, I'm going to give it the name Local Client Match. The intention is very similar to the lowercase letter leading the other names. This way, I can type local into any formula and get a list of the named ranges that apply to whatever worksheet I'm currently within. After typing the name, I need to select my scope. Since I want the name to be accessible when I'm within the sales report, I want the scope to be pointed at that worksheet. Pressing OK creates the name, and now I have a local client match name that is only accessible within the sales report worksheet. A common point of confusion about worksheet scope names is that the name does not have to point to a range within the sales report, even if its scope is sales report. The scope only refers to where you can access the name from. I've probably just confused you more, so let's look at an example. If I go to my formula bar in any cell and type equals local, I can see my local client match name is made available. Now if I go to my client list tab and do the same thing, there is no local client match name. Now I'm going to create a name here on the client list tab called local example, and I'm going to make it scope the sales report tab as well. This will be a name that is usable only on the sales report tab that points to the client list tab. Now still on the client list tab, if I type equals local again, I still have no named ranges, even though I just created a named range that points here. Even though the name points to this tab, I still cannot use it since it is out of scope. If I move back to the sales report tab and type equals local, I see both the local example name and the local client match names. When specifying the scope, you're specifying the ownership of the name, but are inferring nothing about the reference itself. That being said, it is quite rare to create a local name within one worksheet that points to another worksheet. Now, why would we care to use local names? Well, that's fairly complicated and will be something that we build up to throughout the course. But in short, it is useful for names that you might want to duplicate across different worksheets. Let's add a name to our local client match and call it Y Client Match. Now I'll create a copy of the Sales Report tab and call it Historical Report. I'm not going to change anything on it, but imagine that it has a completely different format, different values, different reports, but it's still all looked up based upon the same type of client match search. If you have a bunch of formulas that rely on the Y client match name, you would need to create one with a different letter for this worksheet, say K client match. By copying it, it has created a local version of the name, but you might run into situations where people try to copy that formula, or you try to copy the formula from another sheet, and you end up referencing the wrong name. Using the local client match approach, you're guaranteed to always have the local name being referenced. This also makes it easier for writing functions on sheets that are local, since they'll always start with the local name and you'll always know that that is a name that's specific to the current worksheet. For exercise 3, I want you to go through this workbook or the original exercise 2 workbook, create the named ranges using whatever methodology you want to use, and then update the formulas on the sales report worksheet to use those named ranges. Try to use an approach that minimizes your labor and name size while still being readable and informational. I would recommend using the approach that I started, which already has a few names created for you with part of the formula update. This will conclude our chapter specifically on names. However, we will revisit them in the next chapter when we approach references, dynamic formulas, and ultimately dynamic names, and we will use them throughout the rest of the course.